A millionaire gives $350 to a woman collecting trash, and the next day he sees her at the grave of his lover, who passed away 23 years ago. The blizzard howled through Manhattan's steel canyons, turning streetlights into ghostly halos in the darkness. Through the window of Le Bernardin, Richard Lawson watched a figure hunched over a garbage bin across the street. A woman, he realized, her thin jacket offering little protection against the brutal cold. As she methodically sorted through the refuse, a small bundle strapped to her back stirred a child, barely visible in the swirling snow. 23 years of wealth meant nothing as he watched her trembling hands searching for salvation in other people's waste. Something about her movements seemed hauntingly familiar, stirring memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. He didn't know it yet, but this woman would shatter everything he believed about his past, his late wife Emily, and the lie that had shaped their lives for over 2 decades. In the bitter cold of this winter night, fate was about to unravel 23 years of carefully buried secrets. Before we dive into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. If this is your first time discovering the channel or you haven't subscribed yet, please support us by clicking the subscribe button. It truly means a lot to us. Thank you so much. Richard Lawson had everything money could buy and nothing that truly mattered. From his penthouse overlooking Central Park, he watched the snow blanket the city in pristine white, much like the emptiness that had covered his heart since Emily's death 23 years ago. The December wind rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows, a sound that had become his only consistent companion in the decades of solitude. At 63, he was one of New York's most successful investment bankers, with a net worth that made headlines in Forbes. The financial papers painted him as a ruthless business genius, the ice king of Wall Street who had built his empire in the aftermath of personal tragedy. They weren't entirely wrong. After Emily died, he had thrown himself into his work with a singular focus that bordered on obsession. Money became his way of measuring time quarters, fiscal years, annual reports, anything to avoid counting the days since he'd last seen her smile. His morning routine never varied: wake at 5 a.m., black coffee in the study, where Emily's portrait still hung, browse financial reports until his eyes burned, then visit her grave before heading to the office. The staff at Greenwood Cemetery had grown used to seeing him there, this elegant man in bespoke suits who spoke to a headstone as if it could answer back. Some days he brought fresh peonies, her favorite. Other days just his guilt and regret. The massive apartment felt more like a museum than a home. Everything was exactly as Emily had left it, her books still arranged by color on the shelves, her favorite cashmere throw draped over the reading chair, her recipe box untouched in the kitchen. The cleaning staff had strict instructions never to move anything in what he still called Emily's room's time had stopped in those spaces on February 15th, 2001, the day his world ended. "You should start dating again," his sister Margaret often suggested during their monthly dinners. Emily wouldn't have wanted you to be alone, but Margaret hadn't known Emily like he had. Or perhaps, as recent events would prove, he hadn't known Emily at all. The only change he'd allowed in his life was his charitable giving. The Emily Lawson Foundation donated millions to medical research, though he attended none of the galas or ceremonies held in its name. His accountant handled all the paperwork, and his PR team managed the public image. Richard's only requirement was that each grant recipient received a letter explaining who Emily had been: a brilliant woman who loved art and literature, who died too young from a rare genetic condition that no amount of money could cure. Tonight, as the snow fell heavier outside his window, Richard loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of the scotch he reserved for difficult days. The board meeting had run late, full of young ambitious executives suggesting modernization and restructuring. Corporate euphemisms for dismantling everything he'd built. They saw him as a relic, a lonely old man clinging to outdated methods. Perhaps they were right. He walked to the safe hidden behind Emily's portrait and entered the combination her birthday. Inside, past the documents and jewelry, lay a small leather diary he'd never found the courage to read. Emily had left it for him, along with a note asking him to wait until he was ready. 23 years later, he still wasn't sure if he'd ever be ready to face her final thoughts. The intercom buzzed his security team's evening check-in. "All clear, Mr. Lawson. The storm's getting worse. Weather service is advising against any travel tonight." "Thank you, James," he replied automatically, though the guard's name was Michael. These small slips had been happening more frequently lately. Memory playing tricks, his doctor said. Nothing serious, just age and isolation taking their toll. Looking out at the swirling snow, Richard felt the familiar weight of loneliness pressing down. In all these years, he'd never understood why Emily had been so adamant about not having children. They'd had the means, the space, the love, but whenever he brought up the subject, she'd change the topic with a skill he now recognized as deflection. If they'd had a child, would his life be different now? Would there be warmth in these cold rooms, voices to fill the silence? He didn't know it yet, but the answer to that question was currently digging through garbage bins 6 blocks away, fighting to survive another winter night with a sick child strapped to her back. Sophie Chen never imagined she'd be grateful for a dumpster's relative warmth. Crouched behind Le Bernardin's waste bins, she pulled her thin jacket tighter, trying to shield Daniel's sleeping form strapped to her back. At 28, she had a master's degree in literature from Columbia, gathering dust in a water-damaged apartment, while she gathered other people's leftovers to survive. "Just a little longer, baby," she whispered to Daniel, feeling his feverish warmth against her back. His medication had run out 3 days ago, and the pharmacy's message was clear: no insurance, no refills. The winter had been particularly cruel this year, not just in temperature but in opportunities. The cleaning job she'd held for 6 months had vanished when her employer discovered she was living in a shelter. "We have standards," they'd said, as if poverty was contagious. She'd once been Sophie Chen, promising young scholar, teaching assistant with a bright future. Now she was just that garbage picker, the woman other mothers pulled their children away from when she passed. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd written her thesis on social inequality in Victorian literature, never imagining she'd become a living case study. Daniel's whimper drew her attention back to the present. At 6, he was already too familiar with hunger. Born in the same hospital where his grandmother had died, he'd inherited her delicate features and, tragically, her predisposition to illness. The doctors had warned Sophie about the genetic condition during her pregnancy, but she'd chosen to keep him anyway. A death sentence, they'd called it, not knowing that every day with Daniel felt like a gift she'd never deserved. "Look what we've got tonight," Sophie murmured, carefully wrapping salvageable bread in the clean cloth she always carried. Le Bernardin's waste was a goldmine. Sometimes she found whole meals barely touched, discarded by patrons who'd ordered too much. She'd learned their schedule, knew when the evening rush ended and fresh waste appeared. It was degrading, but dignity wouldn't keep Daniel alive. The restaurant staff mostly ignored her, except for Manuel, the young dishwasher who sometimes left packets of crackers or fruit where she could find them. He'd lost his own mother young, he'd told her once, and something about Sophie reminded him of her. Tonight she found a small container of soup with a note, still warm, for the little one. Her fingers had long since gone numb from the cold, but she continued sorting through the bins. Each salvageable item went into different bags: food they could eat immediately, things to save for later, recyclables she could sell. The local recycling center paid barely enough to notice, but Sophie had learned that survival meant counting every penny. The sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze. Last week, a security guard had threatened to call the police if he caught her stealing again. She'd tried explaining that discarded items weren't legally private property, citing specific court cases, a flash of her old academic self that had only angered him more. "Move along," the guard had sneered, "before your kid ends up in foster care where he belongs." The threat had kept her away for 2 days, until Daniel's fever spiked and desperation drove her back. She'd been a fool to think her education would protect her from life's cruelties. Her professors had never taught her how to choose between dignity and survival. In her tiny apartment, a converted storage room she rented from a sympathetic superintendent, Sophie kept a box of treasures under her bed. Inside was her Columbia diploma, a faded photograph of a woman whose features mirrored her own, and a letter she'd never sent to the millionaire who lived in Central Park West. "Dear Mr. Lawson," it began, but courage had failed her every time she tried to continue. The woman in the photograph, Emily Lawson, smiled out at Sophie with eyes that held secrets Sophie was only beginning to understand. She'd found the photo in a file at the adoption agency, along with medical records that explained too much and revealed too little. The same genetic condition that threatened Daniel had taken Emily's life, a cruel inheritance that blood had passed on despite adoption papers. A gust of wind scattered snow across Sophie's face, mingling with tears she hadn't realized were falling. Daniel stirred against her back, mumbling in his fever dreams about angels in the snow. She had to keep going, had to find enough to make it through another night. Tomorrow she would try again to find proper work, to break free from this cycle of poverty and shame. Tomorrow she would find the courage to confront the truth. But tonight, in the bitter cold behind New York's finest restaurant, Sophie Chen's secret granddaughter of one of the city's wealthiest men continued picking through garbage to keep her son alive. New York City was suffering its coldest winter in decades. The thermometer outside Grand Central Terminal read 5-15 degrees, but the wind chill made it feel like 10 degrees. Weather forecasters called it an Arctic apocalypse, as if ordinary terms couldn't capture the brutality of this December. Fifth Avenue's famous holiday windows offered scenes of winter wonderland, while the reality on the streets told a different story. The National Weather Service had issued its third blizzard warning of the month. 8 inches of snow had already fallen since morning, with another foot expected overnight. The city that never sleeps was finally showing signs of surrender. Subway delays stretched into hours, and even the 24-hour bodegas were closing early. Steam rose from manholes like ghostly sentinels, while salt trucks waged a losing battle against the relentless accumulation. In Sophie's basement apartment, the ancient radiator clanked and wheezed but barely raised the temperature above 50 degrees. Her superintendent had apologized the building's boiler was struggling to heat all 6 floors, and heat naturally rose. What he meant was that the paying tenants above deserved warmth more than the woman who cleaned their hallways. Daniel huddled under 3 blankets, his fever pushing 102 degrees, despite the children's Tylenol she'd rationed over the past week. "Mummy, why can't we turn on the space heater?" Daniel's voice quivered between chattering teeth. Sophie didn't have the heart to tell him they couldn't afford the electricity. Last month's bill had been $180, nearly half her weekly earnings from recycling. The space heater remained unplugged, a useless plastic promise in the corner. Outside, the wind howled through Manhattan's corridors with renewed vengeance. Weather apps showed the gusts hitting 35 mph, strong enough to knock over garbage cans, Sophie's vital food source. She'd learned to calculate her survival in numbers: 400 calories saved from each dumpster dive, 3 miles walked between profitable locations, 6 hours of exposure before risk of frostbite set in. Her fingers were already showing the early signs, red and swollen from too many nights without proper gloves. The wealthy residents of Upper East Side brownstones hurried past in Canada Goose parkas that cost more than her monthly rent, their dogs wearing booties that could have bought Daniel's medicine. Through their windows she glimpsed Christmas trees and crackling fireplaces, scenes from a life that felt as distant as the stars barely visible through the storm clouds. At Mount Sinai Hospital, where Daniel had his monthly checkups, the waiting room thermometer read a comfortable 72 degrees. Sophie treasured these visits not just for the medical care, but for the blessed hours of warmth. Dr. Patterson had started scheduling their appointments for late afternoon, tacitly allowing them to stay until evening rounds began. The cold aggravates his condition, she'd explained to her colleagues, a medical excuse for human kindness. Tonight's forecast promised particular cruelty, temperatures dropping to 1 dec by midnight, wind chills approaching 20 dec, and black ice forming on every surface. The city's homeless shelters were already overcrowded, their capacity stretched by the 40% increase in demand this winter. Sophie had tried them once, but Daniel's coughing had drawn complaints, and the threat of social services involvement had sent them back to their freezing basement. The storm's geometry transformed Manhattan. 3-foot snowdrifts curved against buildings like frozen waves. Ice daggers, some reaching 18 inches, hung from fire escapes like nature's warning signs. The blizzard had already claimed 2 lives, an elderly man in Queens and a homeless woman in Central Park. The city's mortality statistics would label them as weather-related deaths, a sterile term for freezing to death in the world's wealthiest city. In her better moments, Sophie found bitter poetry in the weather. She'd once taught her students about Jack London's To Build a Fire, never imagining she'd intimately understand the protagonist's desperate battle against cold. Now, watching her breath form crystals in the 40-day air of their apartment, she wondered if London had known about the way extreme cold made every decision a matter of survival. The radiator gave one final clank and went silent. In the darkness, Sophie could hear Daniel's breathing, still too fast, still too shallow. The thermometer on his forehead read 102.8 dec, creeping upward despite the medicine. Outside their single window, snow continued to fall, each flake a reminder of nature's indifference to human suffering. 3 blocks away, in his climate-controlled penthouse, Richard Lawson prepared for another sleepless night, unaware that his granddaughter and great-grandson were slowly freezing in the same merciless storm that had taken his wife 2 decades ago. Richard hadn't planned to stay at Le Bernardin so late. The restaurant was nearly empty, most patrons having fled before the storm intensified. But something kept him seated by the window, nursing a glass of Bordeaux that had lost its taste hours ago. Perhaps it was the thought of returning to his empty penthouse, or maybe it was the strange pull of the swirling snow outside, the same kind of weather that had taken Emily from him. Through the frosted glass, he watched the figure again. The woman had been methodically searching through the restaurant's waste bins for the past 20 minutes, her movements precise despite the bitter cold. There was something almost graceful about her efficiency, like a dancer performing a well-rehearsed routine. The bundle on her back shifted occasionally a child, he realized with a tightening in his chest. "Would monsieur like another glass?" the waiter's voice startled him. "No," Richard replied, still watching the woman. "Tell me, how long has she been coming here?" The waiter's professional smile faltered. "The garbage picker? A few months, perhaps. The kitchen staff usually ignore her. She's quiet, causes no trouble." Richard noticed how the waiter avoided mentioning the child. In New York, selective blindness was a survival skill. He reached for his wallet, withdrawing several $100 bills. The week's ATM withdrawal, $350, felt heavy in his hand. "Your check," said the waiter began, but Richard was already standing. "Keep it." All of it. He pulled on his cashmere coat, its warmth suddenly shameful. Outside, the cold hit him like a physical blow. The woman didn't notice him approaching, too focused on carefully wrapping what looked like discarded bread in clean cloth. Up close, he could see her hands were bare, red and swollen from the cold. The child on her back was bundled in what appeared to be multiple layers of thin clothing, none adequate for the weather. "Excuse me," Richard said softly, trying not to startle her. She spun around with the instinctive fear of the hunted, pulling the child closer. In the stark light from the restaurant windows, Richard caught his first clear look at her face. Something about her features, the curve of her cheek, the set of her eyes, struck a chord of recognition so deep it left him breathless. For a moment he could have sworn he was looking at a ghost. "I'm not stealing," she said quickly, her voice educated, incongruous with her circumstances. "There are legal precedents regarding discarded items." "I'm not," Richard paused, struck by the familiar cadence of her speech. "I'm not here about that," I thought. "You might need this." He held out the money. She stared at the bills, suspicion warring with desperate need on her face. The child chose that moment to cough a wet, rattling sound that seemed to echo in the empty street. Richard saw her resolve crumble at the sound. Why, she asked, not reaching for the money. Because it's 5 degrees outside and your child is sick. Richard stepped closer, noticing how she flinched at his movement. Please, take it. Her hand trembled as she reached for the bills, and their fingers brushed briefly. The contact sent an inexplicable shock through Richard. Her skin was ice cold, yet the touch burned with familiarity. Thank you, she whispered, quickly tucking the money into her coat. The child stirred, revealing a small face flushed with fever. This will help with his medicine. Richard found himself wanting to say more, to ask her name, to understand why she seemed so hauntingly familiar, but she was already backing away, gathering her salvaged items with practice speed. Wait, he called out. Do you need a ride somewhere? I can call my driver. No, she cut him off, already turning away. Thank you, but we're fine. She paused, just for a moment, and looked back at him. In that brief glance, Richard saw something that would haunt him for days: a flash of Emily's eyes, the same shade of brown, the same depth of unspoken sadness. Then she was gone, swallowed by the swirling snow, leaving Richard standing alone in the cold. He watched until her figure disappeared completely, fighting an irrational urge to run after her. The rational part of his mind dismissed the resemblance as a trick of light and memory, but something deeper, something that remembered Emily's touch, Emily's voice, knew better. Inside Le Bernardin, his half-finished wine still sat on the table, but Richard was already walking toward his car, pulling out his phone. Michael. He said to his head of security, I need you to find out about a woman who searches through the restaurant's garbage. She has a sick child. And Michael, make it quick. What Richard couldn't know, was that Sophie was already halfway to Mount Sinai Hospital, the $350 clutched in her frozen hand like a lifeline, praying it would be enough to buy Daniel's medicine. And on her mind was a single haunting thought: she had just met her grandfather, and he hadn't recognized her at all. Dawn broke over Greenwood Cemetery with bitter clarity, the mercury still hovering at 3 depth. Fresh snow had transformed the grounds into an otherworldly landscape of white marble and crystallized trees. Richard's footsteps crunched along the familiar path to Emily's grave, his daily pilgrimage unchanged by weather or circumstance. 23 years of routine had taught him to notice any disruption. Today, something was different. Fresh footprints in the snow led to Emily's headstone, too small to be the groundskeeper's. They disappeared beneath a figure huddled beside the grave, head bowed in what appeared to be prayer. Richard's heart stumbled. In all these years, no one else had ever visited Emily's grave. Her family was gone, their friends had moved on, and he'd grown accustomed to his solitary mourning. Yet here was someone else, someone who had braved the brutal cold to reach this spot. As he drew closer, recognition hit him like a physical blow. The garbage picker from last night. She wore the same thin jacket, but the child wasn't with her. She was tracing Emily's name on the headstone with bare fingers, her shoulders shaking with what he first thought were sobs. Excuse me, Richard's voice came out sharper than intended, crystallizing in the frozen air. What are you doing here? She turned slowly, and Richard saw she wasn't crying, she was shivering violently from the cold. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge, a dangerous sign in these temperatures. But what struck him most was her expression, not guilt at being caught, but a deep, resigned sadness. Mr. Lawson, she acknowledged quietly. I was wondering if you'd come today, with the weather being so bad. The familiarity of her tone set off warning bells. You know who I am? Yes, she stood carefully, her movements stiff from cold. I know exactly who you are, just like I know who Emily Lawson was. Richard felt the ground shift beneath him, decades of carefully maintained equilibrium threatening to crumble. Who are you? My name is Sophie Chen. She reached into her coat and withdrew a worn envelope. And Emily Lawson, she was my mother. The world tilted sideways. Richard grabbed the nearest headstone for support, the cold marble anchoring him to reality. That's impossible. Emily never had children. We never. She did. Sophie's voice was gentle but firm. She had me, but she never told you. She gave me up for adoption the day I was born. No, Richard shook his head violently. No, I would have known. We were married. She would have told me. Sophie held out the envelope with trembling fingers. She wrote this letter, explaining everything. I found it when I started searching for my birth parents. Her hand shook harder. I've been coming here for months, trying to find the courage to tell you. Richard stared at the envelope, Emily's distinctive handwriting like a ghost on the yellowed paper. Why now? Why come forward after all these years? Because my son is dying. Sophie's voice cracked. The same condition that killed Emily, it's genetic. Daniel inherited it. The doctors say without treatment she swallowed hard. I've tried everything else. Every job, every program, every charity. But the treatment costs more than I'll ever make picking through garbage. Richard's mind raced, pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. The familiar features that had haunted him last night, the educated speech, the way she'd known he would be here, it all pointed to an impossible truth. The money last night, he said slowly. You could have told me then. Would you have believed me? Sophie asked. A garbage picker, claiming to be your long-lost daughter? I needed you to see me here, at her grave. I needed you to understand that I'm not looking for your money or your name. Her voice broke. I just want to save my son. Your grandson. The word grandson hit Richard like a thunderbolt. He stared at Sophie, really looked at her, and saw Emily in every line of her face. The same determined chin, the same expressive eyes, even the way she held herself against the cold mirrored his late wife's graceful stance. How he started, then stopped, unsure what he was even asking. How had he not known? How had Emily kept this secret? How had 23 years passed without him having any idea he had a daughter? Read the letter, Sophie said softly. She explains everything. She turned to go, her footprints marking a retreat through the snow. Wait, Richard called out, finding his voice. Where's Daniel? Is he? At the hospital. Sophie paused but didn't turn around. They're keeping him for observation until I can pay for his medication. Room 523, Mount Sinai. She took another step, then added, he has her eyes too. Emily's eyes. Richard watched her disappear among the headstones, the letter burning in his hand like a live coal. Behind him, Emily's grave stood silent, its secrets finally beginning to surface after 23 years buried in winter's cold embrace. Richard sat in his car outside Greenwood Cemetery, Emily's letter trembling in his hands. The heat was on full blast, but he couldn't stop shaking. The familiar cream-colored stationery, her perfect penmanship, it was like holding a piece of her again. For several minutes, he just stared at his name written in her hand, afraid that opening it would make everything real. Finally, he broke the seal. My dearest Richard, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. The doctors say I have weeks, maybe days. There's so much I need to tell you, truths I've carried alone for far too long. I pray you'll understand why I made the choices I did, even if you can't forgive them. 23 years ago, before we met, I learned I was carrying a child. I also learned I had a rare genetic condition, one that would eventually take my life. The doctors told me the baby would have a 50% chance of inheriting it. I was 22, scared and alone. Richard's hands clenched the paper. They'd met when she was 23. She'd never mentioned. I made the hardest decision of my life. I gave our daughter up for adoption. Not because I didn't want her, but because I couldn't bear the thought of leaving two people I loved to mourn me instead of one. The adoption agency promised she would go to a good family, one that could give her everything I couldn't. Then I met you, Richard. You were brilliant, kind, and so full of dreams about our future. When you talked about building an empire, about changing the world, I couldn't bring myself to tell you about the baby. How could I burden your dreams with a child you never knew existed? How could I tell you that both she and I might carry a death sentence in our genes? Tears splashed onto the paper, smearing the ink. Richard wiped his eyes roughly, reading on. Her name is Sophie. I made sure she would always know her medical history, even if she never knew me. The adoption agency has all the information about the genetic condition. I've left letters for her too, explaining everything. I hope someday she'll understand that giving her up was an act of love, not abandonment. I know you, Richard. I know you're angry right now, feeling betrayed. You would have stood by me, would have raised her with me. That's exactly why I couldn't tell you. You would have put your life on hold, sacrificed everything to care for us. I've seen how you cope with loss, throwing yourself into work, building walls around your heart. One loss nearly destroyed you. I couldn't bear to risk leaving you with two. The car's windows had fogged up, creating a private bubble around Richard's grief. Outside, the cemetery grounds were empty, snow continuing to fall in silent accusation. The hardest part wasn't giving her up. It was watching you talk about wanting children someday, knowing I had denied you the joy. Every time you mentioned our future family, I died a little inside. But I told myself it was better this way. Better you have a few years of uncomplicated happiness with me than a lifetime of worry about Sophie, about the genetic time bomb we might have passed to her. I've enclosed medical records, adoption papers, everything you'll need to find her if you choose to. But Richard, my love, be prepared she may have inherited more than just my features. If she has the condition, she'll need more than just answers about her past. She'll need help that I can no longer provide. The final paragraphs were shakier, as if written with failing strength. I'm so sorry, Richard. Sorry for the lies, for the years of silence, for the weight of this truth I'm leaving you to carry. But I'm not sorry for protecting you both the only way I knew how. Love doesn't always look like truth. Sometimes it looks like sacrifice, like silence, like letting go. If you find her, tell her I thought of her every day. Tell her that giving her life was the best thing I ever did, and giving her up was the hardest. Tell her that her mother loved her enough to let her go, and that her father would have loved her too, if only he had known. Forever yours, Emily. Richard lowered the letter, his vision blurred with tears. Through the foggy window, he could make out Emily's headstone in the distance. 23 years of daily visits, and he'd never known he was mourning more than just his wife. His phone buzzed a message from his security team. Mount Sinai records confirm Sophie Chen, age 28. Birth mother Emily Lawson. Son Daniel Chen, age 6, admitted last night. Critical condition. Genetic testing shows positive for same condition as EL. Requesting instructions. Richard started the car, his hands steady now. The letter had answered one set of questions only to raise 100 more. But one thing was clear: he had a grandson fighting for his life in a hospital room, carrying the same genes that had taken Emily. And history was trying to repeat itself. Not this time, he whispered, pulling away from the cemetery. Not this time, Emily. If this story of love, sacrifice, and redemption touched your heart, join our community of storytellers and listeners. Every week we bring you powerful narratives that remind us of our shared humanity. Subscribe to stay connected with more emotional journeys that challenge our perspectives and warm our hearts, even in life's coldest moments. Mount Sinai's pediatric intensive care unit hummed with quiet urgency. Through the observation window, Richard watched Daniel's small chest rise and fall, each breath a battle against the same genetic enemy that had taken Emily. The boy's features, peaceful in sleep, were a haunting echo of his grandmother's. His fevers reached 104, Dr. Patterson explained, flipping through charts. The genetic testing confirms it hereditary autonomic disorder, the same variant that affected his grandmother. Without the experimental treatment, his prognosis is... She hesitated, glancing at Sophie. "Tell us," Richard demanded. "All of it." 3 months, maybe less. The doctor's words fell like stones in the sterile air. The treatment protocol costs $850,000. Insurance won't cover experimental procedures. Sophie stood rigid beside Richard, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles showed white. She hadn't slept since Daniel's admission, surviving on hospital coffee in desperate hope. "I can contribute $4,200, she said quietly. "Everything I've saved." Richard turned to her sharply. "I'm paying for it. All of it." No, Sophie's voice was firm despite her exhaustion. "I won't take your money out of guilt or obligation. I didn't come to you for." "This isn't about money," Richard's outburst startled a passing nurse. Lowering his voice, he continued, "This is about family. About not losing another." He couldn't finish. Through the window, Daniel stirred, his fever-flushed face turning toward them. The resemblance to Emily hit Richard again, stealing his breath. The same delicate nose, the same curve of cheek features that had haunted his dreams for 23 years, now fighting for survival in his grandson. "Mr. Lawson," Dr. Patterson intervened, "there's something else you should know. The genetic testing revealed an anomaly. The disorder, it's not coming from Emily's line." Sophie's head snapped up. "What?" "The gene variant causing Daniel's condition, it's not identical to Emily's. It's similar, but it's coming from a different source." The doctor hesitated. "Given the pattern, it's likely from your biological father's side, Sophie." Richard felt the floor tilt beneath him. "That's impossible. I was tested when Emily got sick. I don't carry the gene." A heavy silence filled the room. Sophie's face had gone pale. Unless Emily wasn't sure who the father was, Dr. Patterson finished gently. The implications crashed through Richard's world like a wrecking ball. He stumbled backward, finding the wall for support. All these years he believed he knew Emily, believed their love had been perfect, untouched. But now... "I need to show you something," Sophie whispered, pulling a crumpled envelope from her bag. "I found it last week, but I wasn't sure." With everything else, she handed him a faded photograph. The image showed Emily, young and radiant, standing beside a man Richard knew all too well, James Porter, his oldest friend. They were smiling, her hand resting protectively over her stomach in a gesture that now carried devastating meaning. "James," Richard breathed. She was with James. "There's more." Sophie's voice cracked. "The photo was dated 3 months before your wedding, and this was with it." She handed him a small notebook, Emily's diary from that time. Richard's hands shook as he read the first entry. "James says we should tell Richard the truth. But how can I? He's built our whole future around us having a family together. The baby, she could be either of theirs. I can't destroy both their lives with this uncertainty. Better to give her up. Let her have a clean start." Through the window, Daniel coughed in his sleep, the sound eerily similar to Emily's in her final days. The past and present collided in that moment. Emily's secrets, James's betrayal, Sophie's struggles, and Daniel's fight for life, all connected by invisible threads of DNA and destiny. "I'm calling James," Richard said suddenly, pulling out his phone. "Wait," Sophie caught his arm. "Daniel doesn't have months for us to sort out old betrayals. He needs the treatment now." Richard looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something that transcended DNA. He saw strength, determination, and a fierce love for her child that mirrored Emily's sacrifice. In that moment he realized it didn't matter whose blood ran in Sophie's veins. She was his daughter in every way that counted. "You're right," he said softly. "Dr. Patterson, start the treatment. I'll have the funds transferred immediately." "Richard," I said, "I won't take." "This isn't charity, Sophie. This isn't guilt. This is me choosing to be the father I should have been 23 years ago. He turned to face her fully. Let me do this. Not because of Emily, not because of DNA, but because right here, right now we're family. And family doesn't let each other freeze in basements or pick through garbage to survive. Sophie's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she swayed on her feet, exhaustion and emotion overwhelming her. Richard caught her automatically, and she didn't pull away. For the first time in 23 years, he held his daughter. Through the window, Daniel's monitors beeped steadily, each sound a reminder of the precious time they were racing against. The truth about his parentage could wait. The confrontation with James could wait. Right now, in this sterile hospital corridor, a family fractured by secrets was finally beginning to heal. "We'll figure this out," Richard promised, his voice rough with emotion. All of it, together. Outside the hospital windows, the winter storm raged on, but inside, something frozen for 23 years had finally begun to thaw. The call came at midnight. James Porter was in his London office reviewing investment reports when his private line rang. Only 3 people had this number. One was dead, one hadn't spoken to him in decades, and one. "Richard," he answered, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "She has Emily's eyes," James Richard's voice crackled across the Atlantic. "All these years I thought I was imagining it, but Sophie has Emily's eyes." The fountain pen in James's hand snapped, spreading ink like blood across quarterly reports. He'd known this day would come, had dreaded it for 28 years. "You found her, it wasn't a question." "Did you know?" Richard's voice turned dangerous. "All these years, did you know about Sophie?" James closed his eyes, seeing Emily's face the last time they'd spoken. "Promise me," she'd begged. "Promise you'll protect them both." "I need you on the next flight to New York," Richard continued. "Daniel's genetic tests. They show anomalies. Questions only you can answer." "Daniel. Sophie's son. My grandson. Or perhaps yours." The words hung in the frozen air between continents. James looked at the photo on his desk, himself and Emily at Oxford decades ago. But unlike Richard's copy, this one showed a third person, a young woman with striking Asian features, their mother. "I'll be there in 8 hours, James said finally. "But Richard, it's not what you think." "8 hours, Richard replied. "And James? If you're lying to me again, our friendship won't be the only thing that dies." The line went dead. Mount Sinai's waiting room was eerily quiet at 9 a.m. when James arrived. The storm had kept most visitors away, leaving him alone with his ghosts. Through the window, he watched Richard pace outside Daniel's room, looking exactly as their father had in his final days, proud, angry and terrified of losing something precious. "Mr. Porter," a nurse approached. "They're ready for you in genetics." The blood draw was quick, efficient. As the nurse labeled his samples, James studied his reflection in the window. At 65, he still had their mother's features, the same ones he shared with Emily, the same ones that had marked them as twins from birth. Uncle James. He turned to find Sophie in the doorway, her face a perfect blend of Asian and Caucasian features, their mother's heritage hidden in plain sight for all these years. "You know," he asked softly. "I found Mom's diary last week, the real one." Sophie's voice trembled. "Why didn't you tell me? All those years you watched over me from a distance, why didn't you say you were her twin?" "Because I promised her." James's voice cracked. "Emily. Your mother. She wanted you to have a normal life, free from our family's complications." "Complications?" Richard's voice cut through the room like ice. He stood in the doorway, decades of friendship turning to ash in his eyes. "Is that what you call sleeping with my wife?" "Richard, no." James stepped forward. "Emily wasn't my lover. She was my twin sister." The silence that followed was absolute. "That's impossible," Richard whispered. Emily was an only child. Her parents. Our parents, James corrected gently, were Richard and May Porter. When May died, our father couldn't bear to raise twins who looked so much like her. He split us up. Emily went to his sister in Boston. I was sent to relatives in London. He thought he was protecting us from his grief. But he only created more secrets. Sophie sank into a chair, her world shifting again. Then, the genetic condition comes from our mother's line. Richard, you don't carry it because you were never biologically related to Emily. The man you knew as her father was our uncle by marriage. Richard staggered back, decades of memories realigning themselves. The way you two could finish each other's sentences. How you always seemed to know when she was troubled, I thought. You thought I was in love with her. James's smile was sad. I loved her more than life itself, but not the way you imagined. She was my other half, my twin, separated by a father's misguided attempt to outrun his grief. Through the observation window, Daniel stirred in his hospital bed. James moved closer, seeing his mother's features echoed in the boy's face. We reconnected at Oxford, he continued. Emily was studying literature, I was doing my MBA. One look and we knew, but by then she'd fallen in love with you, Richard. She wanted a normal life, away from our family's tragedy. But the genetic tests, Richard protested. They showed Daniel's condition comes from our mother's line, yes. May Porter was half Japanese, carrying a rare genetic variant common in certain Asian populations. That's why Sophie looks. James gestured helplessly. Like me, Sophie finished. But why maintain the deception after she died? James pulled out an old envelope, the paper yellow with age. Because of this, Emily's last letter to me, she knew she was dying, knew the condition might affect her children. She made me promise to watch over you both, but from a distance, she thought. He swallowed hard. She thought if you knew about our family's history, you'd live your life waiting to get sick, just like she did. Richard sank into a chair, his world transformed yet again. All these years I thought I knew her. You did know her, James said softly. You knew the part of her that mattered most, her heart. She loved you completely, Richard, enough to try to protect you from her family's curse, even if it meant lying to everyone she loved. Oh, through the window, snow continued to fall, covering New York in a blank white canvas. Inside the hospital room, monitors beeped steadily, marking time as 3 generations of secrets finally came to light. Daniel needs both types of blood for the transfusion procedure, the nurse interrupted gently. We'll need samples from all of you. James looked at Richard, his friend, his brother-in-law, the man who had loved his sister enough to visit her grave for 23 years. Together, he asked. Richard nodded slowly, decades of misplaced jealousy melting like snow in spring. Together. The New York Post broke the story on a Tuesday. Garbage picker revealed as Millionaire's heir. By Wednesday, the vultures had descended. News vans clogged Mount Sinai's parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching up like metallic flowers through the falling snow. Inside, Sophie watched her private tragedy become public entertainment. Miss Chen. Is it true you were living in poverty while your father was worth billions? Mr. Lawson. Did you really not know about your illegitimate daughter? What about the child's medical condition? Sources say it's the same disease that killed. Hospital security formed a barrier, but couldn't block the endless buzz of social media. Trash to Treasure was trending. Someone had leaked photos of Sophie picking through Le Bernardine's garbage, juxtaposed with Richard's Forbes cover. The internet had opinions. She's clearly running a scam, one viral tweet claimed. Convenient timing with the kid getting sick. Typical 1%er, another read, let his own flesh and blood freeze while he lived in luxury. Richard's PR team wanted to issue statements, control the narrative. Sophie refused. I won't use my son's illness for publicity, she said firmly. even as her former neighbors were selling interviews about the mysterious garbage lady to tabloids. The worst blow came from her old university. Columbia, where she'd once been a promising PhD candidate, released a statement while we sympathize with MS. Chen's situation, her choice to withhold information about her financial background during scholarship applications raises ethical concerns. "They're taking away my teaching fellowship," Sophie told Richard, her voice hollow. "Apparently I committed fraud by not listing you as family, even though I'd never met you." Richard's jaw tightened. He'd been battling his own demons, board members questioning his judgment, investors nervous about scandal, old friends suddenly remembering odd things about Emily they felt compelled to share with journalists. "Let me handle it," he started, reaching for his phone. No, Sophie's voice was steel. "I won't have Daniel wake up to headlines about his mother being saved by wealthy relatives. He deserves better than their narrative." Through the observation window, Daniel slept on, unaware of the storm brewing around him. The experimental treatment was working, his fever finally breaking, but each bag of medicine came with whispers. The parents in the pediatric ward, who'd once shared coffee and sympathy with Sophie, now watched her with mixed resentment and curiosity. "Must be nice," one mother muttered, loud enough to hear. "Some of us can't afford miracle cures." The comment hit Sophie like a physical blow. She'd spent months beside these parents, sharing their fears and hopes. Now she was somehow different, tainted by an association she'd never asked for. James arrived one morning to find Sophie crying in the hospital chapel. The night shift nurse, she explained, wiping her eyes. She asked if I was one of those people who pretend to be poor for attention, said there are children who really need help, not just rich kids playing poverty tourist. "You've done nothing wrong," James insisted. "Haven't I?" Sophie looked at her uncle, her eyes red. "There are families in this hospital who'd give anything for the treatment Daniel's getting. Children dying because their parents can't afford basic medication. How am I different from them? Why does Daniel deserve to live more than their children?" Before James could answer, Richard appeared in the doorway. His face was grim. "The hospital board is meeting," he announced. "Someone leaked Daniel's treatment costs. There's concern about resource allocation. They want to stop his treatment." Sophie's voice cracked. "No, but they're suggesting we move him to a private facility. They're worried about optics, about other families demanding similar exceptions." Exceptions, Sophie stood, anger finally breaking through her exhaustion. Basic human dignity shouldn't be an exception. Every child in this hospital deserves the same chance Daniel's getting. Richard and James exchanged looks. They'd both seen that fire before in Emily's eyes when she'd fought against injustice. "What do you want to do?" Richard asked quietly. Sophie straightened. "Emily's daughter in every way that mattered. I want to tell the truth. All of it. Not their twisted version, not some PR spin. The real story about poverty and privilege, about mothers choosing between food and medicine, about children dying because healthcare is a luxury." "It could get ugly," James warned. "The media." "It's already ugly," Sophie cut him off. "But maybe Daniel's story can help change things. Not just for him, but for every child in this hospital. Every parent picking through garbage to save their baby." Richard looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not just Emily's features, but her spirit. The same determination to fight impossible odds, to stand up for what was right. "Whatever you want to do," he said softly, "we'll back you. Outside the chapel, reporters still circled like wolves. But something had shifted. The story they thought they were chasing of scandal and sensation was about to become something else entirely. A story about broken systems and broken families, about healing that went beyond blood and biology. Sophie took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "First, we set up a foundation, not just for genetic disorders, but for all children who need help. Then we take on the insurance companies, the hospital boards, the whole system that turns medicine into merchandise. It won't be easy, James cautioned. Sophie looked through the window at the snow-covered city, at the hospital rooms filled with parents fighting private battles. Nothing worth doing ever is. For the first time since the media storm began, she felt steady. Let them talk about trash to treasure. She'd show them what real wealth looked like, not in bank accounts or penthouses, but in the chance to change lives, to fight for those still searching through garbage bins in the bitter cold. Daniel would wake up to more than headlines. He'd wake up to a mother who refused to be shamed for survival, and a legacy of change that started with a winter night and a quest for truth. Daniel's first steps out of intensive care coincided with a rare break in the winter storms. Sunlight filtered through the hospital windows as he wobbled between Sophie and Richard, his small hand trustingly held in his grandfather's weathered grip. Slowly, Buddy, Richard cautioned, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised even him. The boy looked up with Emily's eyes, still fever-bright but clearer now, and smiled. "Tell me about Grandma Emily again," Daniel asked, a new ritual that had developed during his recovery. He settled into his wheelchair, tubes and monitors still attached, but fewer now. Richard glanced at Sophie, who nodded encouragingly. These moments were healing more than just Daniel's body. "Well," Richard began, pulling up a chair, "your grandmother loved winter, believe it or not. She used to say snowflakes were like little messages from heaven. Each one unique, each one perfect in its own way." Like me, Daniel's question carried the innocent wisdom of children. But exactly like you, Richard's voice caught. "She would have loved you so much." Sophie watched from the doorway as Richard pulled out his phone, showing Daniel photos of Emily she'd never seen. Her mother as a young woman, laughing in Central Park, snow in her hair. Emily at their wedding, radiant in white. Emily in quiet moments, reading or painting, unaware of the camera's presence. She liked to paint. Daniel's interest peaked. Art therapy had become his favorite part of recovery. She loved it. Richard reached into his briefcase, withdrawing a carefully wrapped package, "Which is why I brought you these." Daniel's eyes widened at the professional artist's set watercolors, brushes and paper of a quality Sophie could never have afforded. "Richard," she started to protest. "Every artist needs proper tools," he said firmly, but his eyes asked permission. Sophie nodded, throat tight. It was still strange, this negotiation between independence and acceptance, between pride and love. "Can I paint Grandma?" Daniel asked, already opening the set, from the pictures. "Of course you can, sweetheart." Sophie moved to help him set up, but Richard was already there, expertly arranging the supplies with unexpected familiarity. "Emily taught me," he explained, catching her questioning look. "I was terrible at it, but she insisted art was about joy, not talent." As Daniel began to paint, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration, James arrived with breakfast, not hospital cafeteria food, but carefully packed containers from Sophie's favorite Vietnamese restaurant. "Mrs. Nguyen sends her love," he said, setting out the pho. "She's been worried since you stopped coming to the shop." Sophie blinked back tears. Mrs. Nguyen had often fed her for free during the hardest times, waving away attempts to pay. "You remind me of my daughter," she'd say, "lost too young." "Look, Uncle James." Daniel held up his painting, a somewhat abstract but heartfelt rendition of Emily in the snow. It's Grandma sending snowflake messages. James moved closer, his breath catching. Despite the child's untrained hand, something of Emily's essence shone through the watercolors. "It's perfect," he managed. "She would have loved it." The family gathered around the small hospital table, steam rising from bowls of pho like incense in a temple. It was becoming their new normal, these shared meals, these gentle moments between treatments and tests. "I found something else," Richard said after they'd eaten. He pulled out an old leather journal. Emily's art diary. She kept sketches, notes about colors and techniques. I thought, maybe we could learn together. Daniel nodded eagerly, but it was Sophie's expression that caught Richard's heart, a look of such longing, such hunger for connection to the mother she'd never known. "She wrote about you," Richard said softly, opening to a marked page. "Even before you were born. Listen today, my baby moved like a dancer in the womb. I imagine her painting someday, small hands creating beauty just like my mother taught me. Some gifts skip generations, they say, but art, like love, finds its way home." Sophie's hand trembled as she touched the page, tracing her mother's handwriting. "I always loved art class," she whispered. "Even in the shelter schools, it felt familiar somehow." "Genetic memory," James suggested. "Like how Daniel holds his brush exactly like May, your grandmother." They spent the afternoon with the journal, Richard and James taking turns reading Emily's notes while Daniel painted and Sophie sketched. Outside, the city rushed by, unaware of the small miracle happening in room 523, a family piecing itself together through art and memory, through shared blood and chosen bonds. Later, when Daniel had fallen asleep surrounded by his artwork, Sophie found Richard standing by the window. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not just for the art supplies, but for sharing her with us like this." Richard turned, his eyes wet. "I kept her to myself for so long," he admitted. "Hoarded every memory like a miser with gold. But seeing her live on in Daniel's paintings, in your sketches, it's like she's here somehow, bringing us together even now." "I was so angry at first," Sophie confessed. "Angry that she gave me up, that you had all these years with her while I had nothing. But now I see that we all had pieces of her. Your memories, James's connection, my inherited loves. Maybe we needed to find each other to make her whole again." A nurse appeared with Daniel's evening medications, pausing at the sight of the art-strewn room. Her face softened. The other children were asking about the painting, she said. Daniel told them about his artist grandmother sending snowflake messages from heaven. Now they all want to paint too. Richard and Sophie exchanged looks. In that moment, something crystallized a way to honor Emily, to heal not just their family but others too. What if, Sophie began slowly, we set up an art therapy program here in the pediatric ward, in Emily's name? Richard smiled, seeing Emily's spirit shine through her daughter's heart. "I think she'd love that." "Can I help teach?" Daniel asked sleepily from his bed. "I know all about snowflake messages now." "Yes, my darling," Sophie moved to tuck him in. "You can help teach. We all can." As night fell over New York, snow began to fall again, gentle now, more blessing than curse. In room 523, artwork covered the sterile walls, transforming the hospital space into a gallery of love and memory. A family once fractured by secrets had found its way home, guided by an artist's heart that beat on through generations. Richard looked at his grandson sleeping peacefully, at his daughter adding final touches to her sketch, at his brother-in-law arranging tomorrow's art supplies. Emily's last gift to them all, the chance to create something beautiful from broken pieces. The monitors screamed to life at 3:47 a.m. Sophie, dozing in the hospital chair, jerked awake to find Daniel convulsing, his small body rigid against white sheets. His temperature had spiked to 105 def. "Code blue. Pediatric ward," the night nurse's voice crackled over the intercom. "Room 523. Richard, who had been sleeping in the family waiting area, arrived just as they were intubating his grandson. He caught Sophie as her knees buckled. The treatment, she gasped. It was working. He was getting better. Dr. Patterson burst in with her team barking orders. "It's an immune response," she explained rapidly, checking Daniel's vitals. "His body is fighting the treatment. We need to get him stabilized now." Through the controlled chaos, James appeared, still in his evening suit. He'd been at a hospital board meeting about funding for the children's ward. One look at the scene and he was on his phone, calling in specialists from across the country. His pressures dropping, a nurse called out, "Push one of API Dr. Patterson ordered, and get me those blood results from yesterday." Sophie pressed against the wall, watching helplessly as they fought to save her son. Richard's arm around her shoulders was the only thing keeping her upright. The room felt too small, too white, too sterile for the magnitude of what was happening. "The genetic therapy was working," Dr. Patterson muttered, reviewing data on her tablet. Unless her head snapped up. The markers changed, his body's producing antibodies we didn't anticipate. "What does that mean?" Richard demanded. "It means we need a new approach." Immediately she turned to James. "You said Emily had experimental treatments in London." James nodded. "At Royal Marsden. But they were ultimately unsuccessful." "Yes, but why?" Dr. Patterson's mind was racing. "Get me those records. Now. There might be something we missed." The next hours passed in a blur of medical terminology and mounting fear. Daniel remained unconscious, machines breathing for him, while doctors debated treatment protocols in hushed, urgent tones. Around dawn, Dr. Patterson gathered them in her office. The storm outside had intensified, rattling the windows like an omen. The genetic therapy was working too well, she explained. His body started overproducing the corrected cells, triggering an autoimmune response. It's similar to what happened with Emily's treatment, but there's a crucial difference. She pulled up 2 genetic profiles on her screen. "This is Emily's DNA," she pointed to one. "And this is Daniel's. Notice this sequence here? It's not just the disease gene that's similar. There's a secondary marker we overlooked, passed down through your family line, James." "The Porter genetics," James breathed. "Exactly. Emily's treatment failed because it didn't account for this modifier gene. But Daniel has a unique combination, the Porter genetics from Emily's side, and another set of protective alleles, presumably from his father's Asian heritage." "What does this mean for Daniel?" Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. "It means we have a chance. A small one." Dr. Patterson leaned forward. "There's an experimental protocol being developed in Tokyo. It's specifically designed for mixed genetic backgrounds, but what?" Richard pressed. "It's still in early trials, extremely expensive, and given Daniel's current condition, highly risky." "How risky?" Sophie demanded. 30% survival rate." The office fell silent except for the howling wind outside. Sophie closed her eyes, seeing Daniel's recent paintings scattered across his hospital room, snowflakes and angels, his inheritance from a grandmother he'd never met. "If we don't try it?" Richard asked, though they all knew the answer. "Hours. Maybe days." Dr. Patterson's voice was gentle but firm. "His organs are already showing signs of stress." Sophie stood abruptly, moving to the window. Below, ambulances arrived through the storm, carrying other families facing their own medical crises. She thought of Emily, facing similar choices alone, carrying the weight of genetic destiny. "How soon can they get here?" Her voice was steel. "I've already contacted them," James interjected. "The Japanese team can be here in 14 hours. I have a private jet waiting." The cost. Richard was already reaching for his phone. $4 million, plus emergency transport and facility fees. Done. Richard started typing. No. Sophie turned from the window. Not just for Daniel. They all stared at her. There are other children in this hospital with rare genetic conditions. Children whose parents can't afford experimental treatments. If we do this, we do it for all of them. Sophie. Richard started. "Daniel doesn't have time for." "I won't have my son's life bought at the expense of others. Set up a foundation. Fund research. Give other families the same chance we have." James smiled through his tears, seeing his sister's fierce compassion living on in her daughter. Emily would be proud. How much? Richard asked quietly. For a proper research center? Focused on rare genetic conditions in diverse populations, Dr. Patterson calculated quickly. 50 million to start. Make it 100. Richard was already calling his financial team. We'll name it after Emily. Sophie nodded, turning back to the window. The storm was beginning to ease, the first hints of dawn breaking through heavy clouds. Below, she could see other parents arriving for another day of vigil beside their sick children. Dr. Patterson, she said softly, there's a little girl down the hall, Maria. She has a different genetic condition. Make sure her family knows they're included in this. All the families here. No one gets left behind. The doctor nodded, understanding the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about saving one child anymore. It was about changing the system that had forced Sophie to dig through garbage while her son got sicker. I'll call Tokyo, Dr. Patterson said, standing. We should. The alarm from Daniel's room cut her off. They rushed back to find him awake, fighting the breathing tube, his eyes wide with panic. Precious stabilizing, a nurse called out, amazed. He's breathing on his own. Daniel Sophie rushed to his side as they carefully extubated him. Baby, can you hear me? His first raspy words were pure Daniel, did I miss art therapy? The room erupted in tearful laughter. Through the window, the storm finally broke, revealing a sky filled with falling snow, nature's own art therapy, Emily's snowflake messages coming down to bless them all. No, sweetheart, Sophie whispered, holding her son close. You didn't miss anything. We're just getting started. The New York Times article ran on a Sunday, From Dumpster to DNA, a healthcare revolution. Sophie's story had sparked a nationwide debate about medical access, genetic testing, and the invisible line between survival and dignity. The photo accompanying the piece showed her in two worlds on one side, picking through garbage in the snow on the other, standing proudly beside the newly announced Emily Lawson Center for Genetic Medicine. It's not just about Daniel anymore, Sophie explained to the hospital board, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. The same people who'd once whispered about resource allocation now sat in respectful silence. Every day in this country, parents are choosing between food and medicine. Children are dying because treatment is a luxury. That ends now. Richard watched his daughter address the room with growing pride. The timid garbage picker was gone, replaced by a force of nature that reminded him so much of Emily it hurt. The center will provide free genetic testing to any family that needs it, Sophie continued. Full treatment coverage for rare conditions. Research facilities focusing on diverse genetic backgrounds. No one gets turned away because of cost or status. The funding requirements would be astronomical, one board member protested. Which is why the Lawson Foundation is committing $2 billion, Richard announced, causing several board members to choke on their water. And James Porter's investment group is matching it. But James smiled from his corner. Consider it 28 years of missed birthday presents for my niece. The media circus that followed was inevitable. Every network wanted the story the garbage picker turned heiress who was revolutionizing genetic medicine. But Sophie insisted on keeping the focus on the larger issue. Interview them, she told CNN, pointing to the other parents in the pediatric ward. Maria's mother works 3 jobs and still can't afford genetic testing. Kevin's family sold their house for 2 months of treatment. These are the stories America needs to hear. The families began coming forward, first in dozens, then hundreds. Each story was a variation on the same theme: ordinary people, broken by an extraordinary burden. A father in Ohio who lived in his car to afford his daughter's medication. A single mother in Texas choosing which of her twins would receive treatment. A couple in Florida filing bankruptcy over medical bills. This isn't just a healthcare crisis, Sophie testified before Congress. It's a moral crisis. We're telling parents that their children's lives have a price tag, and if they can't pay it, they don't deserve to live. Daniel, now recovering steadily, became the face of both privilege and possibility. His artwork, displayed in the hospital corridors, told stories of winter nights and guardian angels, of dumpster diving and snowflake messages. Other children joined him, turning the pediatric ward into a gallery of hope and heartbreak. But not everyone welcomed the change. Pharmaceutical companies pushed back against the center's research-sharing policies. Insurance companies lobbied against expanded coverage. Conservative pundits questioned Sophie's credentials. "What qualifies a former garbage picker to revolutionize medicine?" one commentator sneered. Exactly that, Sophie responded in a viral interview. "I've lived both realities. I know what it means to watch your child suffer, while help exists just out of reach. No parent should have to dig through trash to save their baby." The interview sparked a movement. Trash to Treasure transformed from a mockery into a rallying cry. People began sharing their own stories of medical poverty, of desperate choices and impossible sacrifices. Richard, watching all this unfold, finally understood Emily's choice in a new light. She had given up Sophie not just to protect her, but because she'd seen the brokenness in the system. She'd wanted her daughter to have a chance at life without the shadow of genetic destiny hanging over her. But she couldn't escape it, he said to James one evening, as they watched Sophie teaching an art therapy class in the pediatric ward. "None of us can." "No," James agreed. "But maybe that's the point. Maybe we're not supposed to escape our inheritance, we're supposed to transform it." The transformation was happening, slowly but surely. Other hospitals began adopting the center's model. Research institutions partnered with the foundation. Medical schools offered scholarships focused on rare genetic conditions in diverse populations. One morning, Sophie found a new piece of art in Daniel's collection, a painting of a woman in winter, reaching down to help others rise from the snow. The signature read, "Maria's mom." "She used to avoid looking at me," Sophie told Richard later. "Now she's teaching art to terminal patients." "You've given people more than just medical care," Richard observed. "You've given them their dignity back." "No," Sophie corrected gently. "You did that when you saw me as more than just a garbage picker, when you chose to help without judgment. Sometimes dignity isn't about what we achieve, it's about how we help others rise." The winter that had nearly claimed Daniel's life was ending. Outside the hospital windows, snow melted into spring promise. But its lessons remained, etched in policy changes and medical breakthroughs, in art therapy programs and genetic research centers. In Emily's old diary, which Sophie now kept in her office at the center, there was an entry that seemed prophetic. "Some inheritances are chosen. Some are thrust upon us. But the greatest inheritance we can leave is the courage to transform our pain into purpose." Daniel, painting beside other children in the hospital's new art room, looked up as Sophie read these words aloud during the center's first anniversary celebration. "Like your snowflakes, right, Mum?" he asked. "Each one unique, but part of something bigger." Sophie hugged her son, feeling the steady beat of his heart, a heart saved by privilege, but now helping save others. "Exactly like that, baby. Exactly like that." Above them, in the hospital's transformed entrance, a new sign glowed softly: "The Emily Lawson Center for Genetic Medicine, where every life has value and no one fights alone." And in the garden below, the first spring flowers pushed through the last patches of snow, proving that even the coldest winters eventually yield to hope. The crisis came without warning. One moment, Sophie was testifying before the State Health Committee about medical access reform. The next, her phone lit up with a series of urgent texts from the hospital. Daniel coding. "Come now." Adverse reaction to new protocol. Dr. Patterson requesting immediate family. She didn't remember leaving the hearing. Didn't remember Richard's security team rushing her through New York's frozen streets. All she knew was the hospital elevator was moving too slowly, her heart pounding in sync with each passing floor number. When the doors opened to the pediatric ECU, something was terribly wrong. The usually quiet ward was in chaos. Doctors rushed past with crash carts. Nurses called out numbers that made no sense. And in the center of it all, through the observation window of room 523, she saw Daniel. Her son's skin had turned a horrifying shade of blue. Pressures crashing. Bop. O2 stats falling. Where's the attending? Someone get that Japanese team on the line. Richard and James arrived moments later, having flown in from London where they'd been setting up the European branch of the centre. They found Sophie pressed against the observation glass, watching helplessly as Dr. Patterson performed chest compressions on Daniel's tiny body. The genetic therapy Dr. Patterson explained between compressions, it triggered a cascade effect. His immune system is attacking the modified cells. It's exactly what happened to Emily in the final stages. The monitor's piercing tone filled the room. "No," Sophie whispered. "No, no, no." Starting another round of epi, a nurse called out. "His system can't take much more," another warned. Through the chaos, a new voice cut through. "I've seen this before." Everyone turned. In the doorway stood an elderly Asian woman in a lab coat, her face bearing a striking resemblance to old photos of May Porter. Dr. Sarah Chen, the foremost expert on genetic disorders in mixed-race populations, who'd flown in from Tokyo the moment she'd heard about Daniel's case. "In the 80s, she continued, moving swiftly to Daniel's side, "we had a similar case. Mixed European-Asian genetics, same disorder. The problem isn't the treatment, it's the timing. We need to reset his immune system completely." That would mean Dr. Patterson's face paled. "Total bone marrow replacement," Dr. Chen confirmed. "Immediately. But we need a perfect match. Mixed genetics make it nearly impossible unless you have a direct biological relative with the same genetic mix." James finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. Everyone looked at Sophie. "I'm not a match," she said, voice breaking. "They tested me last week. The Porter genes aren't strong enough in my DNA." "No," Dr. Chen said quietly. "But I am." The room fell silent, except for the steady beep of Daniel's monitors. Richard stepped forward. "May Porter was my sister," Dr. Chen revealed. "Emily and James's aunt. I've been following this case since it made headlines, but I couldn't. Family politics kept me away. Until now." Sophie stared at the woman, her great-aunt, another piece of her complex genetic puzzle as hope and fear warred in her chest. "The procedure," Dr. Patterson warned, "it's incredibly risky. At Daniel's age, with his condition." "He has hours at most without it," Dr. Chen stated flatly. "I'm offering a chance." "What are his odds with the procedure?" Richard demanded. 30%, maybe less." Sophie felt the weight of generations pressing down on her. Emily's choice to give her up, May Porter's divided family, all the genetic secrets and sacrifices that had led to this moment. "Do it," she said firmly. "Sophie," Richard started, "maybe we should." "No," her voice cracked like a whip. "I will not lose him like Emily was lost. I will not watch another generation die because of family secrets and medical politics. Do it now." Dr. Chen nodded sharply and began barking orders in multiple languages. The room exploded into action. Prep or 3. Start the bone marrow harvest protocol. Get the consent forms. Someone called Tokyo. We need their data now. As they rushed Daniel's bed toward surgery, Sophie caught his small hand. His fingers were cold, too cold. "Mummy's here, baby," she whispered. "Keep fighting. Please keep fighting." Richard watched his grandson disappear through the odd doors, remembering another winter night, another hospital, another impossible choice. He'd lost Emily then, helpless to save her. But not this time. This time would be different. "Sarah," he called out to Dr. Chen, Why now? After all these years? The elderly doctor paused at the awed doors. Because Emily died trying to protect her child from this curse. I won't let history repeat itself. She straightened her shoulders, the same proud porter posture James had inherited. This ends today. One way or another. The Oregon doors swung shut, leaving them in sudden, terrible silence. Sophie sank to the floor, her professional facade crumbling. Richard and James moved to her side, 3 generations of secrets and survival holding each other up as the winter storm raged outside. Above them, the hospital lights flickered as the power grid strained under the blizzard's assault. In the distance, sirens wailed. And behind those, or doors, 2 strands of DNA divided by old grievances but united by love fought to save a little boy who loved to paint snowflakes. They had hours to wait. Hours to pray. Hours to wonder if some genetic curses were too strong to break. Hour 3 of Daniel's surgery, and the waiting room had become a battlefield of unspoken fears. Sophie paced like a caged tiger, her steps marking time between updates. Richard stood at the window, watching the blizzard turn New York into a white void. James sat with his head in his hands, muttering what sounded like old prayers in Japanese. The arrival of the hospital's legal team shattered their vigil. MS. Chen, the lead counsel, began, clutching a stack of papers. There's a situation requiring immediate attention. My son is in surgery, Sophie snapped. Whatever it is can wait. I'm afraid it can't, he glanced nervously at Richard. We've received an emergency injunction from the ethics board. They're questioning the legality of Dr. Chen's involvement, given the undisclosed family connection. What Richard's voice could have frozen flame. The procedure wasn't properly vetted. Dr. Chen's relationship to the patient should have been declared weeks ago. There are protocols. Protocols. Sophie's laugh was razor sharp. My son is dying. Dr. Chen is saving him. What more do you need to know? There are concerns about consent, about potential conflicts of interest. The board is suggesting we pause the procedure until. Pause it. James stood so quickly his chair toppled. Do you have any idea what stopping mid-procedure would do? The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The hospital's reputation. To hell with your reputation, Richard's roar echoed through the waiting room. I built this wing. I fund your research. And you dare. That's exactly the problem, Mr. Lawson, a new voice cut in. Dr. Morrison, head of the ethics board, strode in with an air of bureaucratic authority. Your family's influence over this hospital has created an unprecedented situation. We have other patients waiting months for genetic treatments following proper protocols. How do we justify this emergency exception? Sophie went very still. When she spoke, her voice carried Emily's steel. You want to know about proper protocols? Let me tell you about protocols. 3 months ago, I watched a mother in this hospital choose which twin would get treatment because insurance wouldn't cover both. I've seen families bankrupted by genetic testing costs. Children dying while paperwork sits on desks like yours. She advanced on Dr. Morrison, who took an involuntary step back. You want to talk ethics? Where were your ethics when I was digging through garbage to buy my son's medicine? Where was your concern for proper procedures when other parents were selling their homes to pay for treatments? That's not. My mother died because of protocols. Sophie continued, relentless. Because treatments were too experimental, too expensive, too restricted by people exactly like you. I will not let Daniel die because of more bureaucratic barriers. The law. The law. Richard's quiet voice cut through the tension. Let's talk about law. James, call our legal team. All of them. Then call every media outlet in New York. I want them to hear how Mount Sinai tried to stop a life-saving procedure for a child because his great-aunt didn't file paperwork in triplicate. Dr. Morrison paled. That's not what. Oh, and call the major donors, James added, already dialing. I'm sure they'd be fascinated to hear why their millions are funding an ethics board that prioritizes procedures over patients. The lawyer cleared his throat. Perhaps we could. The Oregon doors burst open. Dr. Patterson emerged, surgical mask still in place. Everyone froze. "What the hell is going on out here?" she demanded. "We can hear you arguing through the doors. We are performing incredibly delicate work." "They want to stop the procedure," Sophie said, voice cracking. "They're saying it's not properly authorized." Dr. Patterson stared at the ethics board team for a long moment. Then she pulled down her mask, revealing a face flushed with fury. "Let me be very clear," she said, each word precisely aimed. "In that room, Dr. Chen is attempting something unprecedented. A full genetic reset using cutting-edge techniques that could revolutionize treatment for thousands of children. If you interrupt this procedure, if you cause us to lose this child because of paperwork, I will personally ensure that every medical journal in the world knows exactly why." Dr. Morrison tried to interject. "I'm not finished. You want ethics? Here's ethics that boy's grandmother died because treatments were too restricted. His mother lived in poverty because the system failed her. Now we have a chance not just to save him, but to develop a protocol that could save countless others. So please, by all means, shut us down. Show the world exactly what kind of ethics you practice." Silence fell. In that silence, monitors beeped steadily from the OR, marking Daniel's heartbeats, each one a victory against time and genetics and bureaucracy. The lawyer spoke first. "Perhaps, given the unique circumstances, we could process the paperwork retroactively." "Excellent idea," Richard said coldly. "James, tell our legal team to stand by anyway." And Dr. Morrison, he stepped forward, every inch the billionaire who had built his empire from grief. "Consider your resignation letter on my desk by morning." As the ethics team retreated, Sophie collapsed into a chair, adrenaline deserting her. "How is he?" she asked Dr. Patterson. "Really?" The doctor's face softened. "Fighting, like his mother. Like his grandmother," she managed a small smile. "Dr. Chen, I've never seen anything like her technique. The way she's integrating traditional Eastern medicine with genetic therapy. It's revolutionary." "Will it work?" Richard asked the question they all feared. "If there's any justice in this world," Dr. Patterson said quietly, "it has to." Through the OR window, they could see Dr. Chen bent over Daniel, her hands steady as she worked to rewrite his genetic destiny. 3 generations of Porter women, May, Emily, and now Sarah, all fighting death in their own ways. Outside, the blizzard began to ease, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if love could triumph over genetics, if family could heal what protocols had failed to save. Part 7 of Daniel's surgery. The Oregon board displayed critical numbers in harsh red digits. Blood pressure dropping, oxygen levels unstable. Dr. Chen's voice crackled through the intercom, her usual calm fractured by urgency. "We need to make a decision, now." Sophie, Richard, and James crowded around Dr. Patterson as she explained the situation. The genetic reset was only partially successful. Daniel's body was fighting the new cells. "There's one option left," Dr. Chen's voice was grave. "But it requires an impossible choice." She explained they could stabilize Daniel by introducing specific stem cells from a close relative. The procedure would save him, but the donor would absorb a significant portion of the genetic disorder. They would be taking on part of his burden, part of his fight. "I'll do it," Sophie said immediately. No, Dr. Chen's response was sharp. "Your genetics are too similar to Daniel's. It would kill you both," she paused, then added, "It needs to be someone with the Porter genes, but different enough to create a buffer." All eyes turned to James. "The risk to the donor," Dr. Patterson said softly, "is substantial. We're talking about voluntarily taking on a potentially fatal genetic condition." James stood straighter, Emily's brother in every line of his face. "How long do we have to decide?" "Minutes," Dr. Chen replied. "His system is crashing." Through the ore window, they could see Daniel's small form surrounded by machines, each one fighting to keep him alive. The boy who painted snowflakes, who saw angels in winter storms, who carried Emily's eyes and May's strength. "Wait," Richard stepped forward. "Test me first." "Richard," James started, "you're not." "I'm his grandfather in every way that matters." Richard's voice broke. "I lost Emily because I couldn't save her. I won't lose Daniel too." "The genetics wouldn't work," Dr. Chen said gently. "It has to be James." Sophie turned to her uncle, the man who had watched over her from afar all these years, honoring his sister's wish for secrecy at the cost of his own happiness. "Uncle James," she whispered, "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking." He was already rolling up his sleeve. "Emily gave up everything to protect you. Now it's my turn to protect Daniel." The condition Dr. Patterson warned, it would manifest within months. There's no cure. "But there's treatment now," James said firmly, "and research, and a whole center dedicated to fighting it." He smiled at Sophie. "Besides, I'm a porter. We're too stubborn to die easily." The monitors screamed again. Daniel's heartbeat was becoming erratic. "Decide now," Dr. Chen ordered. James was already moving toward the hors doors. "Do it." "James, please." Richard caught his arm. "You can't. Turn." "I can." "I must." James's eyes were wet but determined. Emily chose to face this alone. Sophie had to fight it in poverty. But Daniel, he looked at his great-nephew through the window. "Daniel will have all of us, a whole family, to carry this burden with him." Dr. Chen met them at the hors doors. "Once we start, there's no going back. The genetic transfer is permanent." "Like love," James said softly. "Like family." Sophie hugged her uncle fiercely. "Thank you," she breathed. "Just promise me one thing," James whispered. "No more secrets, no more sacrifices in silence. Whatever comes next, we face it together." The Oregon doors swung open, ready to accept another porter willing to trade life for love. But before James could step through, an alarm blared overhead. Code blue. "We're losing him." The next moments were chaos, doctors rushing, machines wailing. Through it all, James's voice hurried. "Start the procedure." Sophie pressed against the observation window, her breath fogging the glass. Inside, she could see Dr. Chen working with desperate speed, transferring cells from James to Daniel. Two lives balanced on the edge of genetic destiny. Richard stood beside her, holding her up as they watched James willingly take on the curse that had haunted their family for generations. In that moment, he finally understood Emily's choice completely. Love didn't always look like truth. Sometimes it looked like sacrifice. The minutes stretched like years. Daniel's monitors continued their desperate song. James lay on the adjacent table, connected to his great-nephew by medicine and machinery and something deeper than blood. Then, suddenly, a new sound cut through the tension. A steady beep, strong, regular, sure. Daniel's heart, finding its rhythm again. Dr. Chen's voice, thick with emotion. "It's working. The new cells are integrating." They watched in awe as color returned to Daniel's cheeks. As James, pale but smiling, reached across the space between tables to hold his great-nephew's hand. Two battles being fought now where there had been one. Two porter men carrying the weight of genetic destiny. But this time not alone, never alone again. Outside the awe, Sophie turned to Richard, tears streaming down her face. "Did we do the right thing? Letting him sacrifice himself like this?" Richard looked through the window at James, who had closed his eyes but was still holding Daniel's hand. "He didn't sacrifice himself," he said quietly. "He chose love, just like Emily did, just like you did. every night in the cold. Through the oar window, they could see Daniel's latest artwork hung on the wall where he could see it during recovery. A painting of snowflakes falling on a family standing together, each flake a different shape, but all part of the same storm. The same story. The same love. The same choice. Stories like The Winter's Redemption remind us that hope can bloom even in life's coldest moments. If this tale of family, sacrifice, and unconditional love touched your heart, consider joining our storytelling family. Every subscription helps us continue crafting these emotional journeys that celebrate the human spirit. Like Sophie and Daniel's snowflake messages, each supporter adds a unique voice to our community. Together, we can keep sharing stories that warm hearts, spark conversations, and remind us we're never truly alone. Subscribe now to become part of our growing family of storytellers and story lovers. Spring came early to New York, but James Porter was still cold. 3 months after the genetic transfer, the first symptoms appeared, just as Dr. Chen had predicted. They found him collapsed in his office at the Emily Lawson Center, where he'd been reviewing research proposals for new genetic treatments. The condition is progressing faster than we expected, Dr. Patterson explained to the family gathered in his private room. The cellular deterioration is accelerated, possibly because of the controlled nature of the transfer. Daniel, now fully recovered, sat on his great-uncle's bed, showing him his latest paintings. At 6, he understood sickness but not permanence. Not yet. "Look, Uncle James, I painted us as snowflakes again. See? You're the biggest one, protecting all the little ones." James smiled through his pain, the expression eerily reminiscent of Emily's final days. "It's beautiful, Danny. You've really captured the Porter artistic spirit." Sophie watched them from the doorway, guilt and gratitude warring in her chest. Her son was healthy, running, laughing, painting everything a child should be. But the cost. The price was written in every new line on James's face, every tremor in his once steady hands. "There must be something we can do," Richard insisted, his voice rough. He'd barely left the hospital since James's collapse. The center has the best researchers in the world, the Japanese team. "He is already here," Dr. Chen interrupted, entering the room. Her face showed the strain of treating another Porter, another victim of their shared genetic legacy. But what James did, it's unprecedented. He didn't just take on the condition, he actively drew it out of Daniel. The damage to his cellular structure is catastrophic. James coughed, a wet sound that made everyone flinch. "Worth it," he managed. "Look at him. Living. Growing. That's all that matters." Daniel looked up from his artwork, Emily's eyes wide in his young face. "Are you cold, Uncle James? You're shaking like I used to." The room went still. Sophie moved to gather her son, but James shook his head. "Come here, Danny," he patted the bed beside him. "I want to tell you something important about our family." Daniel climbed closer, careful of the IV lines of the monitors that beeped in irregular rhythms. "You see these snowflakes you've painted?" James's voice was soft but clear. "Each one is special, unique. But when they fall together, they create something beautiful, something stronger than any single flake could be alone." He looked at Sophie, at Richard, at Dr. Chen, the family that had been fractured and healed, divided and united. "Sometimes," he continued, "one snowflake has to melt so others can keep falling. But that doesn't mean it's gone. It becomes part of something bigger, something eternal." "Like Grandma Emily?" Daniel asked innocently. "Exactly like Grandma Emily." James's eyes filled with tears. "And now like me." Sophie choked back a sob. Richard gripped the windowsill so hard his knuckles went white. "But Uncle James," Daniel's voice wavered, understanding beginning to dawn, "I don't want you to melt." James pulled his great-nephew close, ignoring the pain the movement caused. "Oh, my boy, my precious boy, I'll always be part of your snowstorm. Just look up on winter nights, I'll be there, helping all the snowflakes find their way home." The monitors stuttered, then steadied. Dr. Patterson stepped forward, medical instinct warring with respect for this moment. "We should let him rest," she suggested gently. As they prepared to leave, James caught Sophie's hand. His skin was cold, too cold, but his grip was still strong. "No regrets," he whispered. "Emily chose love over truth. I chose love over time. We're porters, it's what we do." Sophie leaned down to kiss his forehead, feeling the fever burning beneath his ice-cold skin. "We'll find a cure," she promised. "The center, the research, we won't stop until." I know James smiled, Emily smiled, their mothers smile, but some prices are worth paying. Some loves are worth dying for. Outside his window, the last snow of winter was falling, each flake carrying messages from those who had loved enough to let go. The news broke on medical websites. First pioneer of genetic transfer therapy fighting for life, James Porter's case had become a watershed moment in genetic medicine, his sacrifice sparking fierce debates in medical circles worldwide. What he did challenges every ethical framework we have, one medical ethicist argued on CNN, voluntarily taking on a fatal condition to save another. It sets a dangerous precedent. Or a revolutionary one, Sophie countered during the same broadcast, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "My uncle proved that genetic conditions can be transferred, altered, perhaps even shared to reduce their impact. His sacrifice might save thousands." The Emily Lawson Center became ground zero for a new kind of medical revolution. Researchers worked around the clock, studying James's deterioration for insights that might help others. Every decline in his condition brought new data, new understanding, new hope for future patients. But the human cost was impossible to ignore. "They're calling him a hero," Daniel said one evening, showing James the newspapers that had started appearing outside the center. Hundreds of families had gathered, holding candlelight vigils. Many were parents of children with genetic conditions, seeing in James's sacrifice a reflection of their own desperate hopes. "Not a hero," James whispered, his voice weaker now. "Just an uncle who loved his family." The medical community split into factions. Some praised the breakthrough, others condemned the ethics, but they couldn't deny the results. Daniel was living proof that the impossible was possible. Dr. Chen presented their findings at a global medical conference. The Porter Protocol, as we're calling it, demonstrates that genetic conditions can be voluntarily accepted by compatible donors. The implications for treatment are staggering. But in the halls of Mount Sinai, away from cameras and conferences, the reality was more somber. Hospital staff who had witnessed James's decision firsthand walked past his room with quiet reverence. They saw beyond the medical miracle to the man who was paying the ultimate price. 3 more families have offered to attempt similar transfers, Dr. Patterson reported during a private meeting. They're calling it the Porter option. "No," James said firmly, though it took all his strength. "Not until we understand it better. Not until we can guarantee better odds." He looked at Sophie. "No more families should be torn apart by these choices." The center established new protocols named in James's honor. Every genetic research project now had to consider not just the science, but the human element. The Porter guidelines became standard in medical ethics courses. One morning, a young resident found Sophie staring at the growing memorial outside the hospital. Among the candles and flowers were hundreds of paper snowflakes, each containing a message of gratitude or hope. "Your uncle changed everything," the resident said softly. "Not just medicine, but how we think about sacrifice and love." Sophie picked up one of the snowflakes. A child had drawn a picture of 2 people, one giving their heart to the other. The caption read, "Love is stronger than genes." "He didn't want to be a symbol," Sophie replied, her voice catching. "He just wanted to save his great-nephew." But symbols have power. James's story spread, touching hearts beyond the medical community. parents of sick children, donors, researchers all saw in his choice a profound truth about love's capacity to transform even the darkest genetic destiny. In his hospital room, growing weaker each day, James watched the impact of his decision ripple outward like snowflakes in a storm. Each new breakthrough, each life saved or changed, validated his choice even as it took him closer to its inevitable conclusion. Sometimes he told Daniel during their daily art sessions, the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. Just like your snowflakes, buddy, one small crystal can start an avalanche of hope. Outside his window, the world was changing. Inside, a man who had chosen love over life continued to teach them all what real courage looked like. Time became fluid in James's hospital room. Days measured not in hours, but in heartbeats, in breaths growing more labored, in moments of clarity between morphine doses. Sophie had moved a cot into the corner, unable to bear the thought of him facing the night watches alone. Richard practically lived in the chair by the window, as if keeping vigil could somehow slow the inevitable. "You should both go home," James insisted during a lucid moment. Daniel needs to see what real love looks like." Sophie interrupted gently. "What family really means." The boy had transformed his great-uncle's hospital room into an art gallery. Watercolor snowflakes danced across every wall, each one catching light from the machines keeping James alive. In the latest painting, he depicted James as an angel, surrounded by swirling snow, watching over a family below. "Got my wings already, have I?" James joked weakly, but his eyes filled with tears at the sight. The hardest moments came at night, when pain broke through the medication. Sophie would hold his hand while he shook, just as he must have once watched over her from afar, helpless but present. "I found your surveillance reports," she told him during one such night. "All those years you kept track of me. The college fund you secretly set up. The anonymous rent payments when I was struggling." James managed a small smile. "Emily made me promise to watch over you. She didn't say I couldn't help sometimes." "Why didn't you ever come forward?" "Because she also made me promise to let you live free from our family's shadow. From the fear that follows Porter Jeans." His breath hitched. "I just never imagined the shadow would find you anyway." Richard, who they'd thought was sleeping in his chair, spoke up. "You could have told me, James. All those years, watching me grieve alone." "Could I?" James turned his head with effort. "You loved Emily so completely. Would knowing about her twin, about Sophie, about all the secrets, would it have helped your grief or deepened it?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Outside, a late spring snow had begun to fall, as if nature itself was trying to ease James's passage with familiar comfort. Daniel's voice drifted in from the hallway where he was talking to Dr. Chen. "But why can't we just take the sickness back? Uncle James took it from me, so why can't we take it from him?" The adults in the room caught their breath. Sophie moved to intercept her son, but James called him in instead. "Come here, Snowflake." He patted the bed. When Daniel climbed up carefully, James gathered his strength to explain. "Some gifts can only be given once, like your grandmother giving your mother life, like your mother giving you her strength, like me giving you a future." "But it's not fair." Daniel's voice broke. "You're hurting because of me." "No, dear heart." James pulled him close, ignoring the pain it caused. "I'm healing because of you. Every breath you take, every picture you paint, every moment you live free from this burden, that's my joy now. That's my gift." Sophie and Richard watched as uncle and great-nephew held each other, 2 points in a family constellation that had been torn apart by secrets and reunited by sacrifice. Later, when Daniel had fallen asleep curled against James's side, Sophie found her uncle watching him with a mix of love and regret. "Promise me something," James whispered. "Promise me you'll tell him the whole truth someday. About Emily, about me, about all of it." "I promise," Sophie said. But not yet. Not while. Not while I'm here to see his heart break, James finished softly. It's okay. Some truths are better carried in snowflakes than tears. Through the window, the spring snow continued to fall, each flake a message, a memory, a promise of truths yet to be revealed. The truth came in James's final hours, when the morphine and exhaustion stripped away his last defenses. Sophie was alone with him, Richard having taken Daniel home for much-needed rest. Outside, the unseasonable spring snow had turned to freezing rain, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. "There's something else," James whispered, his voice barely audible above the machines. "Something Emily and I never told anyone. Not even Dr. Chen knows." Sophie leaned closer, holding his increasingly cold hand. "What is it, Uncle James?" He struggled to focus, his eyes carrying the same haunted look Emily's had shown in her final photographs. The genetic condition. It's not what everyone thinks. It's not a natural mutation. Sophie's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" "Our mother, May. She was part of a genetic research program in the 1950s. The Japanese government's classified experiments on mixed-race children. They were trying to create enhanced humans, but something went wrong." His breathing grew labored. The genetic modifications they made, they became hereditary, became us. The monitor's steady beeping seemed to grow louder as Sophie processed this revelation. "You mean?" "We're not sick, Sophie. We're living proof of humanity's arrogance, the condition. It's not killing us. It's our bodies trying to evolve into what those scientists intended." He coughed, a wet, desperate sound. But human DNA wasn't meant to be forced. Sophie's mind raced through the implications. Does this mean Daniel is carrying the next stage of that evolution? Yes, but by taking it from him, I've interrupted the process, taken the burden of decades of scientific hubris onto myself. His grip on her hand tightened. The Japanese team suspects, but they can't prove it. If they knew for certain, we'd become lab specimens. Sophie finished, horror dawning. They'd want to study us, experiment. Like they did to May. That's why Emily gave you up. Not just to protect you from Richard's grief or the family curse. She wanted to hide you from the scientists who've been watching our family for generations. A piece of paper slipped from James's trembling fingers, a worn photograph Sophie had never seen before. It showed a young May Porter in a sterile facility, surrounded by men in white coats. Her expression was one of trapped desperation. "They're still out there," James continued, his voice growing urgent, still searching for successful subjects. "Emily hid her pregnancy because she discovered they were tracking her." His voice broke. "She died running from them, not from the condition. The car accident wasn't an accident." Sophie felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew about her family's tragedy reorganized itself into something darker, more sinister. The center, she breathed. All that research is our way of hiding in plain sight. By making our condition public, by turning it into a recognized genetic disorder, we've created the perfect cover. They can't take us now. We're too visible, too well documented as a natural mutation. His breathing grew more labored, machines beeping in warning. "But Daniel, you must protect him. What I did, taking his portion of the genetics, it wasn't just about saving his life. It was about hiding what he's becoming." "What do you mean, becoming?" James's eyes found hers, suddenly clear and bright with fever. "Haven't you noticed? His art, his dreams, his connection to nature, he's what they wanted to create. A perfect evolution. A child who can see the messages in snowflakes because he's meant to bridge the gap between what humanity is and what it could be." Sophie thought of her son's paintings, his uncanny ability to capture emotions in his art, his deep connection to the winter storms. All this time she'd attributed it to talent, to Emily's artistic legacy. "The treatment didn't just save him," James gasped, the machines now screaming for attention. "It hid him. As long as his genetics appear damaged by the transfer, they'll never look closely enough to see what he really is. He pulled her closer, his last secret emerging with his fading breath. Emily died protecting this truth. I'm dying to preserve it. Promise me. Promise me you'll keep him safe. Keep him hidden. Keep him. The machines erupted in alarm as James's final word faded into the storm-dark room. ... free. In the chaos following James's cardiac arrest, as doctors rushed in and machines wailed, Sophie stumbled into the hospital chapel, clutching the photograph of May Porter. But it wasn't the image of her grandmother in the research facility that broke her. It was what she found written on the back in Emily's distinctive handwriting. My dearest Sophie, if you're reading this, both James and I are gone. Now you must know the final truth. You weren't just given up for adoption. You were hidden. The night you were born, they came for you. They'd been monitoring my pregnancy, knowing what the combined Porter-Asian genetics might create. I had minutes to decide. James created a false trail, a stillborn child, official records, a grieving mother. While in truth you were already on your way to safety with a chosen family. The hardest part wasn't giving you up. It was knowing I could never risk finding you, never risk leading them to you. Every time I saw a little girl with dark hair, every time I heard children laughing in the snow, I looked for signs of what you might become. But now that Daniel exists, they'll be watching again. His gifts are stronger than ours ever were. The snow speaks to him in ways even May never experienced. He's what they wanted to create, a perfect bridge between worlds. A child who can read nature's messages and translate them for others. James's sacrifice bought you time, but they'll figure it out eventually. The Japanese research team isn't just studying genetic disorders. They're looking for their lost experiment, the one that finally worked. There's a safe deposit box at Manhattan Trust, Box 2317. Inside is everything you need: new identities, funds, contacts who can help you disappear if needed. I've spent 20 years preparing this escape route, praying you'd never need it. Remember, what seems like a curse is really a gift. What looks like illness is evolution. The snow has always been trying to tell us something. Daniel can finally hear it clearly. Keep him safe. Keep him free. Keep him away from those who would turn his gift into a weapon. All my love. Mom. Sophie sank to her knees in the empty chapel, tears falling freely now. All those years feeling abandoned, feeling unwanted, when in reality she had been fiercely protected, desperately loved. She thought of Daniel's paintings, not just pretty pictures of snowflakes, but actual messages from the natural world. The way he seemed to know when storms were coming, how he could tell which hospital patients would recover just by looking at them, how the snow seemed to dance differently when he watched it. Her phone buzzed a text from the hospital lab. Urgent anomalies in latest genetic scan. Daniel's cells showing unprecedented changes. Request immediate consultation. Then another, from an unknown number. The Porter child displays remarkable abilities. We would like to discuss a research opportunity. And finally, from Richard. Something's happening with Daniel. The snow. It's forming patterns outside his window. Perfect geometric shapes. Sophie, what's going on? She stood, Emily's letter clutched to her heart, James's last words echoing in her mind. Outside the chapel window, the spring snow had stopped falling randomly and was now descending in precise, intentional patterns, as if nature itself was trying to communicate through her son. Sophie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of generations of secrets and sacrifice settling onto her shoulders. She had spent years searching for her place in this family's legacy. Now she knew she wasn't just a lost child found. She was a guardian, chosen by Emily, guided by James, destined to protect something extraordinary. The snow continued its choreographed dance outside, spelling out messages only Daniel could fully read. Messages about what humanity could become if given the chance to evolve naturally, freely, safely. Messages worth dying to protect. Messages worth living to preserve. The Emily Lawson Center transformed overnight. What had been a genetics research facility became ground zero for something far more extraordinary. The children in the pediatric ward, all carrying various genetic conditions, began experiencing strange phenomena. Their artwork started showing impossible patterns. Their dreams contained shared symbols. And the snow danced differently around them all. Dr. Patterson found Sophie in Daniel's room, watching her son teach other young patients how to hear the snowflakes. "It's not just him anymore," the doctor whispered, showing Sophie the latest test results. "Every child who received treatment derived from James's protocol. They're changing, evolving. It's like his sacrifice unlocked something dormant in their DNA." Through the observation window, they watched as Daniel led a group of children in what looked like an art therapy session. But the patterns they drew weren't random. They were complex mathematical equations disguised as snowflake designs, genetic codes hidden in winter landscapes. "The Japanese team is getting suspicious," Dr. Patterson continued. "They're requesting access to all patient records, claiming it's for research purposes, but they know Sophie finished. They finally found what they've been looking for. Not just one evolved child, but an entire generation of them." The hospital corridor filled with parents, drawn to their children's rooms by an inexplicable sense of urgency. Each family had a similar story. Since receiving treatment, their children had developed unusual abilities. Enhanced intuition, accelerated healing, a profound connection to nature and each other. Maria's mother, once suspicious of Sophie, now gripped her hand tightly. "My daughter told me this morning that the snow was singing to her. I thought it was the medication, but then..." She held up her phone, showing a video of perfect crystalline patterns forming spontaneously on Maria's hospital window. Richard arrived with news from the board meeting. They're voting to shut down the center. Too many unexplained phenomena, too many questions about James's protocol. They're afraid. "They should be," a new voice interrupted. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway, her face grave, but not of the children. Of what certain parties might do to them. She pulled Sophie aside, speaking urgently in hushed tones. "I've received inquiries from research facilities across Asia, government programs, military interests. They all want to know about the Porter Protocol and its unexpected side effects." Through the window, Daniel had begun a new painting. But instead of using brushes, he and the other children were somehow directing the frost patterns on the windows themselves, creating intricate designs that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. "It's beautiful," one nurse whispered, watching the display. "It's dangerous," another countered. "People will want to control this." Sophie thought of Emily's letter, of James's sacrifice, of generations of porters trying to protect a truth too extraordinary for the world to handle. But now that truth had multiplied, spreading through the genetics of every child touched by their family's legacy. "We can't hide them all," Richard said softly, watching his grandson lead this unexpected evolution. "No," Sophie agreed. "But we can protect them another way." She turned to address the gathered parents, doctors, and staff. "By standing together. By making this too big to cover up, too public to disappear." Dr. Patterson nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "A sanctuary, not a research center. A place where these children can safely develop their abilities. Where they can learn to use their gifts for healing instead of weapons," Dr. Chen added. Outside, the snow continued its choreographed dance, now visible to everyone watching. The children's collective ability had grown strong enough to make the impossible undeniable. Nature itself seemed to be celebrating their emergence, their freedom to become something extraordinary. The center would need a new name now, something that honored both the sacrifice that made it possible and the miracle it had unleashed. "The Porter Sanctuary," Sophie said finally, "where evolution meets protection." where gifts are nurtured, not exploited. The snow swirled in approval, carrying messages of hope to a world about to change forever. 1 year after James's sacrifice, the Porter Sanctuary held its first winter festival. The hospital grounds, once sterile and forbidding, had transformed into a wonderland where snow fell in perfect geometric patterns, each flake carrying messages of healing and hope. Daniel, now 7, stood at the center of the courtyard with other gifted children, their small hands raised to conduct nature's symphony. Above them, snowflakes danced in double helix patterns, telling the story of their shared evolution. Parents, who had once hidden their children's abilities, now watched in wonder as the impossible became beautiful. "Mum," look, Daniel called out to Sophie. "We're writing Grandma Emily's name in the sky." Indeed, the snowflakes had begun arranging themselves into elegant script, forming not just Emily's name but a perfect portrait of her face. It was as if the photograph Sophie had spent years searching for had been captured in crystalline form, nature itself remembering one of its guardians. Richard stood beside Sophie, tears freezing on his cheeks. "She would have loved this," he whispered. "All she ever wanted was for you both to be free." The Porter Sanctuary had become more than just a medical facility. It was a haven where children could safely explore their gifts, where the line between science and miracle blurred into something new. The Japanese research team had tried to intervene, of course, but it's hard to disappear hundreds of evolved children whose parents now understood their true value. Dr. Patterson and Dr. Chen had developed new protocols, focusing on nurturing abilities rather than treating conditions. The genetic modifications that had once been viewed as a curse were now recognized as the first steps toward humanity's next chapter. In James's old office, now transformed into a memorial library, Sophie found Daniel adding the finishing touches to a special painting. It showed 3 generations of Porters, Emily, James, and May, their figures formed from intricate snowflake patterns. But instead of looking sad or burdened, they were smiling, dancing in the winter wind. "They're happy now," Daniel explained, his small face serious. "They can see what their sacrifices made possible." Sophie hugged her son, feeling the gentle hum of his enhanced DNA resonating with her own partially evolved genes. "They can see more than that, sweetheart. They can see you're safe. Free, exactly what they fought to protect." Through the window, the special snow continued to fall, each flake a reminder of James's sacrifice, Emily's love, and May's unwitting role in humanity's evolution. But now these messages weren't just for Porter children. Every young patient touched by James's protocol could read nature's language, could help translate its wisdom for a world desperately in need of healing. "The snow says we're not alone anymore," Daniel murmured, pressing his hand against the frosted glass. The patterns responded to his touch, spreading outward in waves of crystalline communication. "We're all connected now, just like Uncle James wanted." Above the sanctuary, the winter sky glowed with aurora, like patterns, nature's celebration of children finally free to become what they were always meant to be. Time magazine's cover story said it all: the Porter generation, how one family's sacrifice changed human evolution. The article featured a stunning photograph of children at the sanctuary creating healing fractals in the snow, with Daniel at the center, his hands glowing softly in the winter light. What had begun as a medical mystery had evolved into a global movement. Porter sanctuaries were opening worldwide, each one a beacon for children with extraordinary abilities. The Japanese research team's attempts to claim ownership of the genetic modifications had been thwarted by an unexpected source, their own government, which publicly acknowledged and apologized for the 1950s experiments on May Porter and others. "We choose healing over weapons," the Japanese Prime Minister announced at the United Nations. "These children represent humanity's potential for growth, not tools for power." Sophie, addressing the World Health Organization, stood before a screen showing real-time genetic data translated into artistic patterns by sanctuary children. "We're not looking at mutations or mistakes," she explained. "We're witnessing the next step in human connection, the ability to read and respond to nature's own language." The medical establishment, initially skeptical, couldn't deny the results. Children at the sanctuaries were healing faster, showing remarkable improvements across all conditions. More surprisingly, their abilities seemed to enhance the healing of others around them. Richard had transformed the Lawson Foundation's mission entirely. Instead of just funding research, they now supported families transitioning to life with evolved children. The former garbage picker was now hailed as a visionary, her journey from poverty to pioneering advocate inspiring similar programs worldwide. "Mom," look, Daniel called out during a public demonstration at Central Park. He and other sanctuary children had created a massive snow sculpture, a perfect DNA helix that transformed into a flock of birds, then a school of fish, showing the interconnectedness of all life. Thousands watched in person while millions more viewed online, finally understanding that this wasn't about superhuman powers but about humanity's potential to harmonize with nature. Dr. Patterson's research paper in Nature became the most cited article in medical history, the Porter Protocol when evolution chooses healing. It detailed how James's sacrifice had unlocked not just genetic potential, but a new understanding of human consciousness and its relationship with the natural world. Even the skeptics were silenced when the sanctuary children began helping with natural disasters. Their ability to read weather patterns and communicate through nature's networks provided early warnings for storms, earthquakes, and tsunamis. Lives were being saved by the thousands. The old guard of medical ethics had to revise their entire framework. Dr. Morrison, who had once tried to stop Daniel's treatment, now headed the International Committee for Evolved Medicine. "We were wrong," he admitted publicly. What we saw as a condition to cure was actually an invitation to grow. In the end, it wasn't just about genetic evolution. It was about the evolution of human compassion, understanding, and acceptance. The world had watched a desperate mother digging through garbage to save her child and witnessed how that love had transformed into a movement that was changing what it meant to be human. The snow still carried messages, but now everyone was learning to listen. On the 5th anniversary of James's sacrifice, snow fell on New York City in perfect spirals. Inside the Porter Sanctuary's memorial garden, Daniel, now 11, stood before 3 crystal monuments, one for Emily, one for James, and one for May. Each sculpture seemed to catch the light differently, sending rainbow patterns dancing across the fresh snow. "They can see us, can't they?" he asked Sophie, his young face wise beyond its years, in every snowflake, in every pattern. "Yes, sweetheart," Sophie replied, watching as other sanctuary children joined them, their combined abilities making the snow create living portraits in the air. "They're part of the message now, part of the miracle." Richard, his hair now fully white, smiled as he watched his grandson lead what they called the Winter Remembrance. The children had designed it themselves, a ceremony where their gifts honored those who had sacrificed everything to protect them. "Emily would have loved this most of all," he said softly to Sophie. "Not just that you and Daniel are safe, but that her sacrifice created a place where no child has to hide what they are, where no mother has to dig through garbage to save her baby." The sanctuary had grown far beyond its original walls. Where once there had been only hospital rooms, now gardens bloomed even in winter, their flowers sustained by the children's connection to nature. The old emergency room had become a training center where newly evolved children learned to use their abilities for healing. Even the parking lot had transformed into a park where snow fell in educational patterns, teaching visitors about everything from physics to poetry. Dr. Chen, now director of the Global Sanctuary Network, joined them by the monuments. "The latest statistics are remarkable," she reported. "Over 10,000 children worldwide showing evolved abilities. And not just reading nature's messages, they're beginning to write new ones." As if to demonstrate, Daniel raised his hands along with dozens of other children. The snow responded, forming complex mathematical equations that solved themselves in midair, then transformed into music notes that somehow played on the wind. It was beautiful, but more importantly, it was free, exactly as Emily and James had wished. "Look what they left us," Mum Daniel said, creating a final pattern, a perfect family tree made of snowflakes, showing how love could flow through generations, transforming pain into purpose, curse into blessing. They gave us everything. Sophie hugged her son, feeling the gentle resonance of their shared genetics, no longer a burden to bear, but a gift to celebrate. Around them, other families gathered, their evolved children playing in snow that danced with meaning, their former fears transformed into wonder. Above the garden, the winter sky cleared to reveal stars that seemed to pulse in harmony with the children's abilities. Nature itself celebrated this new chapter in human evolution, not one born of laboratory experiments or military ambitions, but of love, sacrifice, and the courage to become what you were meant to be. "The snow still carries messages," Daniel whispered, as crystal flakes settled on his upturned face, "but now they're all about hope." And in that moment, watching her son stand free and strong beneath a sky full of meaningful snow, Sophie finally understood. Her journey from garbage picker to guardian of humanity's evolution had never really been about genetics at all. It had been about love, the kind that transforms suffering into strength, the kind that turns secrets into salvation, the kind that makes heroes out of ordinary people just trying to save their children, the kind that falls like snow, unique and perfect, carrying messages of hope for all who learn to listen.